The wool chafed her collarbone, a permanent reminder of her invisibility. She was the shadow in the ballroom, draped in funeral black for a brother she barely knew, ordered to sit, nod, and vanish. Then the heavy oak doors splintered open and the monster of the northern campaigns walked in. The dress weighed 10 pounds at least. Margot knew this because she had washed it herself in the copper tubs below stairs, hauling the sodden black bombazine over the lip of the basin until her knuckles split. Now, completely dry and tightly laced, the fabric felt less like a garment and more like a punishment. The high collar dug into her throat with every shallow breath. The dye, set with cheap vinegar, still carried a faint, sour tang that rose whenever her body heat spiked in the stifling, overcrowded ballroom. She sat on a rigid, gilt-backed chair shoved against the furthest wall of the Carlyle estate. She was supposed to be invisible. Her uncle had made that abundantly clear in the carriage ride over. Sit in the corner. Do not speak unless spoken to, which you will not be. Your mourning period is a reflection of this family's piety, Margot. Do not make a spectacle of your brother's disgrace. 5 years. Her brother had died of a fever in a debtor's prison 5 years ago, leaving massive gambling debts that Lord Carlyle had grudgingly absorbed. Margot's penance was permanent mourning. It was a convenient way to keep a 24-year-old dependent out of the marriage mart, ensuring she never drew an ounce of attention away from Carlyle's legitimate daughters. Margot pressed her thumb against the coarse seam of her skirt, letting the friction ground her. The ballroom was an assault on the senses. Hundreds of tallow candles burned in the grand chandeliers overhead, dropping microscopic beads of hot wax onto the polished floorboards and heating the room to a suffocating temperature. The air was thick with the scent of roasted mutton from the dining hall, cloying rosewater, and the distinct, sour odor of nervous aristocrats sweating through their silk undershirts. A quartet played in the opposite corner, sawing frantically at their stringed instruments. The violin was slightly out of tune, emitting a high, reedy squeal every time the bow hit the E string. It made the muscles in Margot's jaw clench. She watched her cousin Diana giggling behind a painted ivory fan, fluttering her eyelashes at a pale, wealthy viscount whose chin seemed to recede directly into his neckcloth. It was all a transaction, a meat market dressed in satin and tulle. Margot didn't pity herself for being excluded from the auction. She merely hated the physical discomfort of having to watch it. The heavy grandfather clock in the hall chimed the half hour, 10:30. Another 2 hours before she could retreat to her drafty room and unlace the corset that was currently bruising her lower ribs. Then, the ambient noise in the room shifted. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic silence. It was a gradual receding of sound, like the tide pulling back from a rocky shore. The out-of-tune violin faltered, scraping to a halt. The low murmur of gossip died in the throats of the dowagers. Margot looked up from her scuffed black shoes. The main double doors had been thrown wide open. A gust of cold, bitter November wind swept into the oppressive heat of the ballroom, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and impending frost. Standing in the threshold was Conrad, the Duke of Ainsley. He did not look like a duke. He looked like a man who had just crawled out of a trench. His dark coat was impeccably tailored, but his shoulders were too broad, too rigid, straining the seams. He lacked the polished grace of the London gentleman. There was a slight drag to his left leg when he finally stepped into the room, a stiffness that spoke of shattered bone, knitting back together poorly. Margot observed him with a detached, clinical fascination. She had heard the rumors, of course, everyone had. The Duke of War, the butcher of the northern sieges. He had inherited the title mid-campaign when his father died, and had only returned to England a month ago, bringing with him a reputation for ruthless efficiency and a distinct lack of aristocratic manners. Lord Carlyle scrambled forward, his face flushed, bowing so deeply he nearly toppled over. Conrad barely looked at him. He handed his heavy, rain-spotted cloak to a terrified footman. The Duke's face was hard, the skin tanned and weathered like old saddle leather, crisscrossed with faint white lines. A more prominent scar cut straight through his left eyebrow, pulling the skin slightly and giving him an expression of perpetual, dangerous skepticism. As the host began to stammer through a sycophantic greeting, Conrad's eyes swept the room. They were a pale, washed-out gray, cold, exhausted. He looked at the sea of glittering jewels, the pastel dresses, the desperate, hungry eyes of the mothers calculating his vast income. Margot watched his jaw tighten. He hated it. The realization hit her with surprising clarity. He hated this room, these people, and this noise just as much as she did. Conrad gave a terse nod to Carlyle, cutting the man off mid-sentence, and began to walk. The crowd parted for him instantly. They wanted his title, but they were terrified of his physical presence. He moved with a heavy, predatory momentum, bypassing the tables of iced champagne and the line of hopeful debutantes pushing themselves forward. He was walking toward the edges, toward the shadows. Margot felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation. No, she had claimed this miserable dark corner. It was the only good thing about her humiliating black dress. It acted as camouflage against the oak paneling, but as the towering, dark-clad figure drew closer, she realized he wasn't looking at the room anymore. He was looking at the empty, velvet-cushioned chair sitting exactly 2 feet to her left. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't adjust her posture to look demure. She just sat there, breathing shallowly against the whalebone of her corset, her hands folded in her lap, watching the most feared man in England march directly toward her sanctuary. Conrad stopped. The sheer mass of him blocked out the glaring light of the chandeliers, casting Margot in a sudden, cool shadow. Up close, the smell of the ballroom vanished, replaced entirely by him. He smelled of rain-soaked wool, harsh lye soap, and a metallic tang that reminded her of old pennies. He didn't look at her. He looked at the chair beside her, with a heavy sigh that sounded like a bellows pushing air out of a cracked forge. He collapsed into it. The delicate wooden frame let out a terrifying creak under his weight. He stretched his stiff left leg out in front of him, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared at the floorboards. Margot froze. She was painfully aware of the sudden shift in the room's attention. 100 pairs of eyes, previously tracking the Duke's every move, were now fixed on her corner. She could practically hear her uncle's blood pressure rising from across the room. She was supposed to blend in, not share breathing space with the evening's primary target. She slowly turned her head, looking at his profile. He was breathing heavily, a slight, rattling wheeze catching in his chest with each inhale. His hands dangling between his knees were massive. The knuckles were heavily calloused, and the tip of his left ring finger was missing. The skin healed over in a smooth, puckered nub. "If you stare any harder, you'll burn a hole through my coat," he stated. His voice was gravelly, pitched low, devoid of the musical inflection upper-class men usually employed. Margot's mouth clamped shut. She felt a flush of heat hit her cheeks, but she suppressed the urge to look away. "I was merely calculating how long the chair will hold before it splinters under your weight, Your Grace. It's decorative." Conrad turned his head. His pale gray eyes locked onto hers. Up close, the scar through his eyebrow looked brutal, severing the muscle cleanly. He didn't blink. For a long, agonizing second, the silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Margot's fingernails dug into the palms of her hands. She had spoken out of turn. She had been impertinent to a duke. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. "Let it break. The host owes me for making me stand in the freezing damp for 10 minutes before his useless footman opened the gates." He leaned back, the chair protesting loudly again, and finally took her in. His gaze dragged over the dull black bombazine, the severely pinned hair, the lack of lace or jewelry. He frowned. It wasn't a look of disgust, but one of genuine confusion. "Who died?" Margot blinked at the bluntness. Society dictated that one offered condolences, danced around the subject of death with euphemisms. "Lost to us. Passed on." "My brother," she said, her voice flattening out. 5 years ago." Conrad's brow furrowed further. 5 years? You wear black for 5 years?" "I wear black because it is required of me," she answered, the bitterness leaking through her careful control. It is a highly effective method of ensuring I remain a piece of furniture. He looked at her hands, gripped tightly in her lap, and then back up to her face. He seemed to register the tight defensive set of her shoulders. He opened his mouth to reply, but a throat cleared loudly in front of them. Lord Carlisle had finally summoned the courage to breach the corner. He stood there, practically vibrating with nervous energy, dragging a beaming, desperately blushing Diana by the elbow. "Your Grace," Carlisle puffed out, his eyes darting angrily toward Margot, before fixing on Conrad. "I do apologize for the draftiness of this wing. Please allow me to introduce my daughter, Diana. She has been most eager to hear of your triumphs abroad." Diana curtsied perfectly, her pink silk dress rustling. Conrad didn't stand up. The insult was glaring, heavy, and deliberate. He stared at Carlisle, then at Diana, his expression turning to stone. "I don't discuss my campaigns, Carlisle," Conrad said flatly. "It ruins the appetite." Carlisle paled, his mouth opening and closing like a landed trout. "Oh, quite right. Perhaps then, a dance? The musicians are striking up a waltz." Conrad stared at the eager, terrified girl in pink. Then he looked at the ring of mothers closing in, behind Carlisle, eyeing him like vultures. He looked trapped. He hated the noise. He hated the expectation, and he clearly had no intention of spinning a giggling debutante around a sweltering room. Suddenly, Conrad stood up. He turned his back on Carlisle and Diana entirely. He looked down at Margot. "Stand up," he commanded. Margot's heart slammed against her ribs. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He held out his scarred, heavy hand. "We are dancing." Panic flared cold and sharp in her chest. "I cannot. I am in mourning. It is strictly forbidden." "By whom?" Conrad growled, his eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous irritation. "Him?" He jerked his head toward Carlisle, who was currently gaping in horror. "I outrank him. Stand up." Margot looked at his outstretched hand. The calluses. The missing finger. She looked past his hip to see her uncle's face turning a dangerous, mottled purple. If she took that hand, the fragile, quiet, miserable life she had built would detonate. She would be punished. She would be screamed at. But as she looked back at Conrad's face, she saw the challenge there, and beneath it, a desperate, exhausted plea to be spared from the charade of the room. He didn't want her. He wanted a shield, and she, cloaked in untouchable black, was the perfect barrier. A cynical, reckless urge flared inside her. Let it detonate. Margot placed her bare hand into his. His grip was startlingly firm, calloused, and hot. He pulled her to her feet with enough force that she stumbled, her heavy black skirts tangling around her ankles. He didn't offer a polite apology. He simply dragged her past her sputtering uncle, past her open-mouthed cousin, and marched her directly toward the center of the ballroom floor. The music hadn't even started, but the crowd scrambled backward, parting for the Duke and the miserable black-clad spinster, as if they were a pair of wolves let loose in a sheep pen. The musicians, terrified by the sudden vacuum in the center of the room and the hostile glare the Duke shot in their direction, fumbled their instruments to their chins. A cello groaned a low, mournful starting note. It was a waltz, but played with the hesitant, erratic tempo of men fearing for their lives. Conrad did not bow. He did not ask for her permission a second time. He simply stepped into her space, closing the agonizing gap, and clamped his right hand onto her waist. Margot gasped, a sharp, undignified sound. It wasn't the heat of his touch that shocked her, but the sheer weight of it. His hand spanned the curve of her ribs, the heavy pressure pressing the rigid whalebone stays of her corset painfully against her skin. It was a grip designed to hold a sword, to rein in a warhorse, not to guide a woman across a polished floor. "Put your hand on my shoulder," he ordered, his voice a low, rough rumble that she felt in her own chest before she heard it. She obeyed, her arms stiff. Beneath the fine, damp wool of his coat, his shoulder felt like carved granite. There was no give to the man, no softness. He grabbed her right hand with his left, his rough, scarred palm scraping against her knuckles. The nub of his missing finger pressed directly into the sensitive skin between her thumb and forefinger. It was a startlingly intimate deformity. He took the first step. It was a disaster. Conrad didn't glide. He marched. He pulled her into the movement with a jerky, lopsided momentum, dragging his bad leg in a sweeping, heavy arc that forced Margot to scramble backward to avoid having her toes crushed. Her heavy black bombazine skirts, designed for sitting silently in corners, tangled instantly around his boots. "You are stepping on my hem," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the scrape of their shoes. "Then pick it up," he shot back, his eyes fixed firmly on the wall over her shoulder, his jaw locked. Margot swallowed the surge of pure, unfiltered rage. She gripped the heavy folds of black fabric with her free hand, hauling the dress up a scandalous 2 inches, exposing the scuffed leather of her practical boots. They stumbled through another turn. The music swelled, a frantic, disjointed melody that perfectly matched the chaotic violence of their dancing. It was agonizing. Every time he pivoted on his left leg, a sharp, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his arm, a physical manifestation of pain he refused to acknowledge. He was sweating now. The faint, metallic smell of copper and rain deepened, mixing with the harsh scent of lye soap. "You are making a spectacle of me," Margot said, fighting to keep her voice level as he wrenched her through a sharp, jarring turn that nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. "My uncle will lock me in the attic for a month for this." Conrad finally looked down at her. The scar through his eyebrow pulled tight. "He was trying to sell me your cousin. I do not like being sold to." "So you decided to ruin me instead?" "You were already ruined," he stated bluntly, devoid of any cruelty, simply stating a tactical fact. "You are wearing a funeral shroud at a ball, sitting in a corner like a discarded piece of furniture. You have no value to them. That makes you the only safe thing in this room." The absolute clinical truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She didn't want to agree with him, but the cynical core of her recognized the logic. He hadn't picked her because he found her alluring, or because he felt pity for her. He picked her because she was a social dead end, a barricade. "I am not a shield, Your Grace," she managed to say, her lungs burning as the corset restricted her airflow. The room was spinning, a blur of shocked pale faces and glittering chandeliers. "You are right now," he grunted, dragging her into another rigid turn. He stumbled slightly, his bad leg giving way for a fraction of a second. His grip on her waist tightened to a bruising pressure to keep himself upright. "Uni." Margot didn't think. She reacted. She shifted her weight, leaning into his solid frame, anchoring her hand more firmly onto his shoulder to absorb his sudden instability. Hummed for a single, fleeting second. The violent tug-of-war between them ceased. They were just two people, heavily burdened by physical and social constraints, holding each other up in the middle of a hostile crowd. Conrad looked at her. Truly looked at her, his pale gray eyes wide with a flash of unguarded surprise. He felt her shift, felt the sudden, deliberate support she offered instead of the resistance he expected. His breathing was ragged, loud in her ear. "Your leg is failing," she whispered, her face inches from his chest. "It holds," he rasped defensively, though the sweat beating at his temples told a different story. "You have made your point. You have insulted my uncle, terrified the debutantes, and cemented your reputation as a brute." She looked up, meeting his exhausted, cynical stare. "Now, stop dancing before you collapse and force me to drag you to the perimeter. I'm quite certain my dress is too heavy for that." A sound escaped his throat. It was a harsh, scraping noise, halfway between a cough and a bark. It took Margot a second to realize the feared Duke of War was laughing. "You are entirely too practical for this room," he murmured, the hostility in his voice fading into a rough, weary amusement. "Someone has to be," she replied. The music ground to a halt, the musicians finally giving up the charade. The silence that slammed into the ballroom was deafening. No one clapped, no one moved. The air was thick with scandal, heavy and suffocating. Conrad stopped moving. He stood there, chest heaving, his hand still clamped tightly around her waist. He didn't let go immediately. For 3 long heartbeats, he kept her anchored against him, the heat of his body seeping through her cheap black dress. Then, slowly, deliberately, he released her. He took a step back, his face instantly sealing over, becoming the cold, unreadable mask of a butcher once again. He gave her a short, jerky nod, turned on his heel, and limped straight toward the grand double doors. He didn't look back as he walked out into the freezing November night. Margot was left standing entirely alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 100 pairs of eyes that were no longer ignoring her. They were burning her alive. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. Before the heavy oak doors had even clicked shut behind the Duke, a collective, vicious murmur erupted across the ballroom. It sounded like a hive of hornets disturbed from a nest. Margot stood frozen on the polished floorboards, her lungs screaming for oxygen against the rigid stays of her corset. Her waist still throbbed where his massive hand had clamped down, leaving a phantom ring of heat through the coarse bombazine. She didn't get the chance to retreat to the shadows. A hand, clammy and trembling with rage, clamped violently around her upper arm. "You stupid, insolent, wretched girl," Lord Carlisle hissed, his spit hitting the side of her cheek. His face was a terrifying shade of mottled plum, the veins in his temples bulging against his thin, powdered skin. He didn't care about the watching crowd anymore. He dragged her with a startling, frantic strength, his fingernails biting through the thin fabric of her sleeve. Margot stumbled, her heavy skirts twisting around her calves, but she forced herself to stay upright. To fall now would be the ultimate humiliation. He hauled her roughly into a small, dimly lit antechamber off the main hall, designed for gentlemen to smoke and argue politics. It smelled stale, of cold ash and spilled brandy. The moment they crossed the threshold, Carlisle slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off the noise of the ballroom. He shoved her. Margot hit the edge of a mahogany side table. The sharp corner dug viciously into her hip, sending a jolt of pain radiating down her leg. She caught herself before she hit the floor, gripping the edge of the wood, her knuckles turning white. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Carlisle was vibrating, pacing the small room like a rabid dog. "The wealthiest man in England. A man looking for an heir. A man I specifically invited to meet your cousin. And you throw yourself at him like a common streetwalker in a morning gown." "I did not throw myself at him." Margot kept her voice low, desperately trying to modulate her breathing. Her hip throbbed. "He commanded me to stand. I had no choice." "Liar," Carlisle roared, spinning around to face her, his eyes wild. "You saw an opportunity to humiliate this family, just as your degenerate brother did. You sat there, plotting, dragging his attention away from Diana. You tainted him, you touched him. He left without a single word to my daughter." Margot looked at her uncle. The pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes was staggering. She had always known she was a burden, a financial ledger in the red, that he was forced to balance out of societal obligation. But this wasn't resentment. This was the fury of a man who had just seen a fortune slip through his fingers. "He did not want Diana," Margot said, the cynical truth slipping out before she could bite it back. "He did not want any of them. He hates it here. He used me to prove a point." Carlisle crossed the room in 2 strides, raising his hand. Margot flinched, turning her face away, bracing for the crack of his palm against her cheek. The blow never landed. The heavy antechamber door didn't just open. It exploded inward. The brass handle smashed violently against the plaster wall, sending a shower of white dust drifting to the carpet. Conrad filled the doorway. He had not left the estate. His heavy wet cloak was draped over one shoulder, dripping muddy rainwater onto Carlisle's pristine Persian rug. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying violence. The pale gray eyes locked onto Carlisle's raised hand, and the temperature in the small room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. "If you touch her," Conrad said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, deadly whisper that barely carried over the sound of the rain lashing against the windows, "I will snap your wrist, pull the bone through the skin, and beat you to death with it." Carlisle froze, his hand suspended in mid-air. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, stammering incomprehensible sounds of terror. Conrad didn't look at him again. He stepped fully into the room, his bad leg dragging heavily, the limp more pronounced now. He walked directly to Margot. She was clutching the mahogany table, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide. She looked at the giant of a man standing before her. He smelled overwhelmingly of the storm outside, of ozone and wet earth. He looked at her hands, white-knuckled on the wood, then up to her face. He noted the slight flinch she hadn't completely repressed, the defensive angle of her shoulders, his jaw clenched, the muscle ticking violently beneath the scar. "You are bleeding," he stated flatly. Margot blinked, looking down. The sharp corner of the table had snagged the fabric of her skirt, tearing the seam, and a thin, hot line of blood was soaking through the bombazine at her hip. She hadn't even felt it cut the skin. Conrad turned his head slightly, just enough to bring Carlyle back into his peripheral vision. Carlyle whimpered, pressing his back against the floral wallpaper. "Oh, I require a wife," Conrad announced to the room at large. His tone was conversational, businesslike, completely divorced from the physical threat radiating from him. "My estates are falling into ruin because my stewards are thieves. The local gentry plague my door with their simpering daughters. I require someone to manage the house, balance the ledgers, and act as a permanent barricade against polite society." He looked back down at Margot. "I will pay off your brother's remaining debts. I will reimburse your uncle for your keep. You will come to the north with me. You will never have to wear that wretched black dress again, and no one will ever raise a hand to you." Margot stared at him. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Oh, this wasn't a proposal. It was a military extraction. It was a negotiation of terms. He was offering her a trade, her administrative labor, and her social undesirability, in exchange for physical safety and financial independence from Carlyle. "Why?" she asked, her voice raspy. "You could have any woman in that ballroom." "I don't want them," Conrad replied, stepping closer, closing the distance until she had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes. "They look at me and see a title. They see money. They see a monster they think they can tame." He reached out, his scarred, calloused hand, hovering for a second before gently, deliberately, brushing a stray lock of hair away from her damp forehead. "You looked at me," he murmured, "and you saw a man whose leg was failing, and you leaned in to hold me up." He dropped his hand. "Pack your trunks. We leave at dawn." The frost on the carriage windows looked like shattered glass. Dawn had not so much broken over London as it had bled through the gray fog, a bruised, pale light that did nothing to warm the damp November air. Margot sat stiffly against the worn velvet squabs, the jolting of the wheels over the rutted cobblestones sending sharp, rhythmic spikes of pain radiating from the hastily bandaged cut on her hip. She had packed exactly one trunk. It contained 3 threadbare linen shifts, 2 pairs of thick, worsted stockings, a handful of cheap novels with cracked spines, and nothing else. She had walked out of the Carlyle estate without a single word of farewell. Her uncle had locked himself in his study, too terrified of the Duke to physically prevent her departure, but too spiteful to offer a parting blessing. Conrad sat opposite her, an immovable mountain of dark wool and brooding silence. In the cramped, enclosed space of the carriage, his physical presence was overwhelming. He took up too much room, his broad shoulders brushing against the mahogany paneling, his long legs stretched out to accommodate the stiff, ruined joint of his left knee. The smell of the storm still clung to him. Wet earth, cold rain, and the harsh bite of lye soap, mixing with the musty scent of the carriage's ancient upholstery. He had not spoken since he ordered the coachman to drive. His eyes were closed, his head tipped back against the corner, but he wasn't asleep. The tension in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip of his hands on his thighs, and the shallow, ragged intake of his breath betrayed him. The damp chill of the morning was wreaking havoc on his shattered bones. Margot watched him with the same clinical, detached observation she had used in the ballroom. She felt no sudden swell of romantic affection. She felt the heavy, terrifying weight of reality. She had traded a familiar, silent prison for an entirely unknown one. She was entirely at the mercy of a man known for butchery. Yet, as she looked at the deep lines of exhaustion carved around his mouth, the panic that had been humming in her chest began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard pragmatism. He didn't want a damsel. He wanted a barricade, a manager. The carriage hit a vicious rut in the road, tossing Margot against the side panel. Conrad let out a low, sharp hiss, his eyes flying open as his left leg jerked violently. He reached down, his massive hand clamping over his thigh, his breathing turning into a rapid, shallow wheeze. Margot didn't ask if he was all right. It was a stupid question. Instead, she leaned forward, ignoring the throbbing in her own hip, and reached under the opposite seat. She dragged out the heavy iron foot warmer the grooms had loaded before departure. The coals inside were still radiating a fierce, dry heat. Using the toe of her scuffed boot, she pushed the iron box directly against the sole of his left boot. Conrad froze. He looked down at the heat source, then slowly brought his pale gray eyes up to meet hers. "The damp sets into the marrow," Margot said, her voice flat, devoid of pity. "My brother suffered from a shattered collarbone. The cold always made the muscle lock." Conrad stared at her for a long moment. He didn't thank her. He didn't offer a gentle smile. But slowly, he relaxed his grip on his thigh and let the ambient heat from the iron box seep up into his ruined leg. The frantic ticking of the muscle in his jaw began to smooth out. "Your hip," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Is it bleeding through the bandage?" "No," she lied. He grunted, clearly not believing her, but he didn't push. He reached into the heavy folds of his driving coat and pulled out a leather flask. He unscrewed the silver cap and held it out to her. "Drink it," he ordered. "It's brandy. It will dull the ache." Margot looked at the flask. It was battered, the leather stained dark with age and use. She took it, the metal warm from his body heat, and took a small, cautious sip. It burned like liquid fire sliding down her throat, leaving a trail of pure, numbing heat in her stomach. She coughed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, and handed it back. They drove in silence for another 3 hours until the dense smog of London gave way to the rolling, frost-bitten countryside. The coach swung into the courtyard of a sprawling stone-built coaching inn. Conrad did not wait for the footman. He forced the carriage door open himself and stepped out into the freezing mud. He turned back, holding out his hand. Margot took it, bracing herself against his solid weight as she stepped down, her black bombazine skirts dragging heavily in the muck. "Inside," he said, gesturing toward the inn. "I have booked a private parlor." When she entered the room, a roaring fire was already blazing in the hearth, smelling strongly of dry pine and wood smoke. Resting on the center table was a large, unadorned wooden box. Conrad limped into the room behind her and pointed at the box. "Open it." Margot stepped forward. She unlatched the brass hinges and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in simple brown paper, was a dress. It wasn't silk or satin. It wasn't adorned with lace or pearls. It was made of thick, high-quality wool, dyed a deep, vibrant shade of forest green. Beneath it lay a pair of soft leather riding boots and a thick, fur-lined cloak. She stared at the fabric. It was the color of the pine trees outside, of life, of oxygen. It was the antithesis of the suffocating, sour-smelling black she had worn for 5 years. "I sent my steward to purchase it this morning while you packed," Conrad said from his place by the fire, holding his hands out to the flames. He didn't look at her. "There are no corsets in that box. There are no whalebone stays. It is designed for the north, for riding, for breathing." Margot's fingers brushed the soft wool. A sudden violent lump rose in her throat, thick and heavy with 5 years of suppressed grief and humiliation. "Take off the bombazine, Margot," he said quietly, using her given name for the very first time. It sounded strange in his rough, gravelly voice, grounded, real. "Leave it on the floor. I will have the innkeeper burn it." She turned to look at him. He was watching the fire, the orange light casting harsh shadows over his scarred face, illuminating the exhaustion and the quiet, unwavering strength beneath it. He hadn't bought her a dress to make her beautiful. He had bought her a dress to make her comfortable. She didn't cry. Crying was for heroines in novels. Instead, Margot turned her back to the feared Duke of War, reached up to the suffocating high collar of her funeral dress, and finally began to pull the pins loose. Margot's choice to discard her mourning gown wasn't a surrender. It was a declaration of war against her past, forging an unbreakable alliance with the Broken Duke. Their survival now depends entirely on each other as they ride into the brutal north. If you felt the biting chills of the carriage and the warmth of the fire, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel, share this story, and turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic upload.